Okay, here we are going to review some tips for our Niagara Falls trip. I hope the audio is good and I hope you are well. A couple of tips for going to Niagara Falls. Before you sit down, decide your buy-in amount. So usually it's a spread 100 to 200, sometimes 50 to 200, sometimes 100 to 300. So you're going to decide what your buy-in is going to be and then what your rebuy is going to be if you lose your chips. So generally, if you feel like you're one of the weaker players, you want to buy in for the minimum, which is likely going to be $100. And then if you feel like you're one of the stronger players, you're going to buy in for the maximum, which could be $200 or $300. The choice is up to you. Generally, it's easier to play when you have a shorter stack because your risk of going broke is less because you have less money in front of you to lose each time. And then obviously as your stack gets higher and higher, hopefully, um, that can get a little bit more complicated. But I'd probably recommend you just buy in for the minimum each time. And then when your stack gets low, if your stack gets low, you could reload up to the minimum again. Um, they'll just give you a little bit more play. Next, decide your bankroll for the entire night. Is it going to be 300, 600, 1,000? Just don't deviate from this plan unless there's extreme circumstances, like I put a super drunk, terrible few players are spewing money late at night, which can happen sometimes. You could be down some money, but you notice that there was tremendous action and you have to stay and play even though you're down some money. So as soon as you sit down, so for a standard 9 or 10 handed table, you'll usually get about 30 to 35 hands an hour. So this means every hour you're going to go around 3 times. So you're going to be in the big blind 3 times, in the small blind 3 times, on the button 3 times every hour. So what I recommend you do is take the first half hour to 45 minutes, which is about, say, 2 orbits around, about 20 hands, and fold pretty much all of your hands, obviously unless you get an absolute monster, and really focus on watching the other players at the table and try to define at least 80% of them into one of two categories. So the first category is, are they tight or are they loose? So over these 20 to 30 hands, how many hands have they played? If they had played, say, more than 12 out of the 20 or 25 hands, then they were considered loose. If they had played less than 5 hands, you've barely seen them in the pot, then they're considered tight. So you basically want to have a mindset for at least 80% of the players as to whether they're tight or whether they're loose. Then the second question you want to answer for each player is, are they aggressive or are they passive? So watch to see how they enter the pots. Do they limp or do they raise? When someone else raises, do they call the raise or do they re-raise? If a player calls more than they bet or raise, they're considered passive. If they raise or re-raise more than they call, they're considered aggressive. So you can call each of these players passive or aggressive. So what this basically gives you is 4 different categories of players. You could have a tight passive player, you could have a tight aggressive player, you could have a loose passive player, or you could have a loose aggressive player. And that gives you 4 categories. And after you've defined, as many as you can, obviously you're only getting a certain number of hands, but these should become clearer and clearer as you go through the night. Then you can use this information to make better decisions against each of these players. So this is just a general concept of how I would play once I understand whether the players fall into these categories. So if the player is tight passive, so tight means that they're not playing a lot of hands, and passive means that they're not betting or raising a lot. Against tight and passive players, I would bet most of the time against them once I'm on the flop, because even tight players who mostly play quality hands, they will miss the flop most of the time. But if they call on the flop, I would tend to lean towards checking and trying to get to the river as cheap as possible. Because they are tight, they probably have good quality hands. If they call a bet, they are likely to be happy with the flop. If they start betting the turn and start betting the river, I would fold everything but my best hands. So you basically still want to, be aggressive against them and bet against them on the flop, but ultimately you want to um, get 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 away from them if they start showing aggression or if they don't fold themselves. Next category will be loose passive players. So this is again, they're passive, so they're not betting and raising a lot, but they're loose, so they're playing a lot of pots. This is the best type of player to be against. And this type of player is fairly easy to play against as well. So they tend to play way too many hands, and then when they do um, bet or raise, it's usually a sign. Again, similar to tight and passive, if you have any passive opponent and suddenly they start betting and raising, that's a red flag. That's like, holy, watch out. This is a passive player who's suddenly all of a sudden betting and raising. So you can categorize that in both ways. They're both dangerous when they're suddenly playing aggressively if they're a passive player. But these are the kind of players that you're gonna bet before the flop. You're gonna bet again on the flop. You're probably gonna bet again on the turn against them most of the time because they will sometimes, because they're loose, they might call a bet on the flop with nothing or almost nothing and then fold on the turn. So you do have to play these guys a little bit more aggressively than you would against a tight passive player. But you also will get a lot of value against these players when you hit the flop because they will pay you off. Then you have the third category, which is tight and aggressive. And this is more or less the style I tend to play. And they're really tough opponents to play against. You'll likely see that. If most of the players at your table are tight and aggressive, it's really time to move on and find another game, to be honest. The players won't play many pots, but when they do play the pots, they will be aggressive. They'll be raising and betting a lot. It'll be the kind of player where you don't see them for like an hour, and then all of a sudden they come out of nowhere, like then they win a big pot, and then you don't see them again for an hour. Against these opponents, you usually need to have a hand, and you need to hold on. Because they are tight, they're more susceptible to bluffs. So I do tend to bluff tight, aggressive players more often than if it were a passive player because they don't trap as often. Sometimes with passive players, both tight passive and loose passive, even if they flop three of a kind or they flop a flush or they have a full house, they often won't bet it. They'll be a little bit more trappy, whereas a tight aggressive player, they tend to be less trappy. So that therefore, if they stop betting or if you raise them at some points, they can make folds. A tight aggressive player can make a fold even with a top pair, whereas a loose player will just be like, oh, sigh, I'm going to have to pay this off, and they'll call, 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 call. So the tighter players, you actually can bluff a little bit more than looser players, which includes tight aggressive players as well as tight passive players. Loose passive players, loose aggressive players, which we're getting to next, do not bluff these guys or gals very often. So the final type of person is a loose aggressive person. These kind of type of players can be a double-edged sword. They may win or lose a lot every night, depending on how hot or cold they're running. You can make a lot of money off loose and aggressive players. And generally speaking, you just want to play fairly straightforward against them. So you're not gonna do any fancy things. You're gonna bet your strong hands, and you can also. The only suggestion, I generally don't kind of slow play or trap my hands very often, but if I'm playing against a loose aggressive maniac kind of player, then I may play my hand a little bit slower than normal, because I know that they tend to, because they're aggressive, if they sense that their opponent is weak, they might bet, they might bluff, 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 bluff. So playing against a loose, aggressive player can be like sort of hold on to your hats. You will have to call them down in situations when against any tight players you would fold. So that is part of the reason that they can win more often. But yeah, so that's sort of the idea of aggression. So that those are the four types. So that would be my sort of rule of thumb is when you first get to the table, sit down, play really tight yourself, and just focus on your opponents. Focus on looking at them, saying how many pots are they playing, and are they playing are they betting and raising a lot, or are they checking and calling a lot? And that will give you a great insight for the next 4, 5, 6 hours, however long you play. And then when a new player comes to the game, that's what you're looking at. You know, they sit down, did they play three of the first four pots? Are they splashing in there? Are they betting and raising all the time? Or are they just going fold, 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 fold? And that'll give you a great idea, sort of as a general concept of how to play against those different player types. A couple of more tips right at the end. Take lots of breaks. There's many different ways that you can get a few free hands. You can fold right after you have your big blind, and then you can leave for a few hands, and when you come back, you just have to surrender your small blind. You can also fold after your button and then miss a few hands and come in closer to your big blind. And you can also fold just before the big blind, and then you can take an entire round if you want to take a bit longer. But just don't be afraid to get up, stretch around, walk around for a couple hands, use the washroom, whatever. Especially if you take a beat or if you're mentally feeling a little bit volatile, take some time, walk around from the table. You're allowed to do it at any time. And then finally discuss your hands with your friends. So after you play a pot and you're not quite sure what's going on, you can certainly remember the hand, remember how it went out, and then me and Johnny will talk to you about it. We can sort of, analyze it. So that's really the logistics of it, the gists, the logistics of sort of categorizing players. And this is much more effective than like, oh, let's try and get a read off them. Are they signed and therefore they're strong, or are they looking down, therefore like those are kind of stupid. This is more ways of categorizing based on how they're actually playing throughout the night. And these can always be slightly tweaked. Like you might see someone who you think is loose, and sometimes opponents will change throughout the night. So they might start off really tight. Maybe they're coming to the casino and they're like, I'm going to play really tight. I'm going to do my best. And then they take a bad beat a couple hours in and suddenly they're super loose because they're tilty and they're frustrated and maybe they've had 3 or 4 drinks. So I don't necessarily set these in stone. I like to have a general idea of what's going on and then adjust sort of accordingly as I go throughout the night. So what I'm going to do now is I just fired up a little 50-cent sit and go on PokerStars because I figured it was a pretty good opportunity to sort of look at, let me try and line this up, to look at some opponents and try and categorize them into these 4 categories like in real time. So this is just a sit and go. I think everyone has a bunch of big blinds, say, I don't know, 20 big blinds. So it's still pretty early on in the tournament. So I'm going to just go, I've had to play a few hands on the side. So I've had to just sort of go and okay. So passive, I'm just gonna start that. He limped in. So he was the first one to act and he limped in. This guy also limped. So I might consider him passive. Okay. And this guy checked. Okay, let's see what happens on the flop. And everyone checks on the flop. So this already tends to look like a fairly passive group of players, which is good. Obviously, you can imagine this scenario. It's just now we got to figure, are they passive and tight or are they passive and loose? And that can only really be determined when you see 10 or 15 hands and you're like, okay, they've seen like 7 out of the last 8 flops. They're loose as well. So this guy limped into 6s and then he's trapped. So I would even mark this guy What do I mark him? Passive. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call him tight or loose because he's passive trappy. I'll just put passive and trappy. Okay, so this guy just went all in for about 10 big blinds. Probably going to be aggressive. I'll just mark. Again, we're not going to know that much. I'm just sort of giving you an example. We don't know if he's tight or loose or not. So we know this guy's played one hand, this guy's played one hand. We'll see if they play another hand. This guy went all in again. Okay, now this guy just called. So 3 hands in a row he's played. I might considering him loose after playing 3 hands. This guy just called behind, and this guy's now called 2 hands. So I might call this guy passive and loose as well. And then a bunch of people went all in. I mean, it is a tournament, so people are going to play all sorts of wonky. Now everyone's just going all in. I don't know. Looks like this guy might take it down. And he does with his king queen. Play it all super weird. And that guy's also loose. The fact that he just called with tens, I mean, he's out of the tournament. Actually, sorry. I'll mark him as passive as well. Because just called with 10-10. That's a very sort of passive style. So we got a just call and a just call by these two, Iron Donk and this numbered guy. Okay, this guy just bet a little bit more than the flop with top. I would consider him probably tight. I've only seen him play one hand, and it was ace queen, which is a very strong hand. But again, not too much information. I'm just giving you an example. I would not be able to say with 100% certainty. I mean, this guy limped in for a second time, so I'm going to call him passive. Much more of a caller, a limper. And maybe I'll change this guy's color because he seems to be a bit tighter. I'll make him red just for the, the sake of this video. Everyone else is yellow, who I think is passive. Okay, this guy limped in again as the first one in, so I've already known him as passive. He's played a couple of hands. If he plays a few more, I might call him loose as well. But we'll have to sort of keep our eye on that one. Let's see, how long have we been recording? Well, not bad, 18 minutes. This isn't going to be a crazy long one. Okay, that wasn't very exciting. Okay, so again, this guy limps, and now we're going to call him loose. This is actually a weird spot. Normally, I might consider going all in over top of this guy. I'm just going to fold because I want to get lots of hands in. But with the blinds where they are, whatever. We don't have to talk about tournament strategy. Don't worry about how I'm actually playing this game because that's not what the point of this video is about. This guy limped in, both blinds called. Now he's just going to go all in for way over the size of the... So passive loose is actually really good. Ace king, I'm going to have to play this hand. I'm just going to shove all in, just make it simple. And then that way we don't have to worry about trying to do too much. Just kind of keep our stack at a decent size so we can play lots and lots of hands and get some opinion. This fight in. I haven't seen him play many hands at all, so he might be a tighter player. So we've got this guy's passive and trappy. This guy's passive and loose. So we already have a decent representation of a few of the players. This guy folds another couple hands. I'm going to consider him tight. Let's fight in. Okay, folded again. So I'll just kind of consider him tight. We'll mark him with a red, just so we know. This iron guy just called, so he's tight, but maybe he's tight passive. Iron donk, tight passive. If I had to say my read, I would say this fight in is probably going to be one of the better players at this table, or like the only player that might not be terrible. I guess that's another way of putting it. That guy was loose positive. So we were to queen. We're going to do a tiny little bet and then fold if anyone raises. I'm just going to bet like 115 into 400. Very small bet. And win a little bit of chippies. You can see what this QX guy has. He had 10 fives. He had a pair of fives there. And he was just curious. Okay, this guy's loose passive, so it's more likely for him to go all in than to just call. And you can see this iron and this feed in have both played many less hands than a lot of the others. I'm just gonna fold here. I could raise with it, but again, I just want to see a bunch of hands. Usually, the way tournaments like this go is the first 5 or 10 minutes are pretty loose, and then when it gets down to this, where it's like the top 3 make the money, it gets a lot tighter. So everyone will play a little bit tighter than a normal sort of 9-handed game. So it might not be super accurate, but it should still give us a little bit of way to play. So another kind of way that someone is passive is when they just call the small blind versus raising from the small blind. So if everyone folds, then the small blind just calls. That's often the sign of a passive player. Okay, and again, this guy has not really played a hand, period. So I might just add very tight. So he might be the tightest player at the table. Ace queen, that's a good hand. We're just going to go all in likely, no matter what. Or everyone just folds. That works too. Okay, a couple aces. We'll see if we can get some chips in the pot with this hand. Okay, we got this guy who limped, and we know he is passive and loose, and this guy is also passive, but also trappy. So we're gonna raise it up quite a bit. Let's go 800. This guy here, XQS, is probably the most tight player. Or sorry, the most loose player. It's another spot we can just rip it in. There's only this one guy that has us covered. And the big blind that we know is super tight, so we can sort of take advantage of that. And this guy limps in again, which is just a... I'm just going to put very loose. The fact that he's limping in when he only has, less than 8 blinds in his stack is pretty bad. And this guy limp behind, of course, so we know that he's loose and passive. So everyone is sort of continuing to further cement our beliefs on how they're playing. And this iron guy likely is going to be tight and passive because he has done more checking and limping than anything else. Just fold there to get some more hands in. I probably would raise that if that were a normal. I mean, this guy is probably tight and passive. You're pretty much going to get just passive players at these games. He limped in with King 9, which is, it's not the worst. But he certainly should be raising that. It's going to do a little raise with this King Queen suited. We got an all-in from that player. And 2 callers, so we're not going to mess around, but obviously we flop top 2 pair. So the pot is like 1200. We're going to bet like 700 into it. We're happy to get our stack in with top 2 pair here. This was the guy that called us with the middle pair here, so maybe he's got a king. Easily call him. He's got a king. And they're almost drawing dead. They're both drawing totally dead there. So again, this player, basically we knew he was passive and we knew he was trappy. So that worked to our advantage. And I'll call him loose too. Most people that are passive will end up being looser. Or sorry, more trappy. So we flop a gut shot. Not much else going on here. I guess I'll just play this out if you're interested in sort of watching. It's going to be harder to get reads now because there's only 5 players at the table, so it does change the dynamic. You can pretty much tell that everyone at this table is going to be very, very passive, like just checks, just limps. It's not dissimilar to casinos with a lot of callers, a lot of passive players. We could raise that one just to get heads up against this guy. Wouldn't be a terrible play. The A7, but we've got a pretty sizable chip lead, so there's nothing really much I have to do here. I trust Iron Donk. He's got top pair against bottom 2. And the short stack doubles up. But yeah, that was also, I mean, he was in the small blind there. So I got an ace 5-handed. The short stack is in the big blind, so we're certainly going to call if he goes all in here. See, now that I have, and no matter what, I'm never folding on this flop. I have ace high, and he's got 10 high, so we're ahead. Obviously, he's got a flush draw. And now this is actually a really good time. We'll talk a little bit about tournament poker because I have okay, I'll have to describe it. Because it pays the top 3 and there's 4 players left and I have a lot of chippies, then I can play super aggressively because no one wants to get 4th place and get nothing. So you can see I can build my stack pretty wildly in this situation. And really, even if one of these guys calls, I have them covered so aggressively that it should be fine. I'll call off with an ace high against either of these guys. We have a slightly bigger ace. Obviously, we hit our kicker, so we're in good shape. And now that there's 3 players left, we'll get loose again. Everyone will get loose because they're like, hey, I'm in the money. Yay, yay. I can just fold here. I can just go all in. Oh, he called. All right, we're not in terrible shape. So that was, again, more pressure on him than me, or sorry, because there was a shorter stack that had already folded. It's kind of a weird, it's called ICM. It's about poker tournaments. Okay, so we got 2 players all in. Again, the short stack doubles up. So now we should have a little bit of play in chips because everyone's got at least over 10 big blinds. Obviously jacks, we're gonna jack it up. Get it? Jack it up. Make it 1500, basically half the stacks, and then no matter what, we're all in. Terrible flop for us, but what are you gonna do? Oh my goodness, that was a dirty river. But that guy was obviously loose in a sense of like ace 10. He should have gone all in instead of calling off all in. So now we're heads up. It's just totally different game, but at least it's going to be quick. We're just waiting for the one time where we get our section. Oh my god, passive very loose. Okay. All right, there we go. A slight dog, but that's okay. And we got lucky to win the tournament. So anyway, don't ignore all the heads up and three-handed stuff because that's a totally different style. Oh, look at that. I won $1.99. What am I going to do with all those winnings? All right, I'm going to end it here. It's been half an hour. I hope that this worked, and I hope you enjoyed this video on how to sort of set up understanding your opponents when you're at the table. Peace.